So there are a lot of examples of how not to do things, right? Quite easy, oh, I looked at your profile on LinkedIn, and what if this Wednesday we set up a call so that I could pick your brain? And that is stomach churningly bad. That is exactly how not to do things. The best attitude is to ask yourself, how can I add value? And that is the question I ask myself too. you know it is not simply, okay, let me put in money into a startup and then take out 10 times the amount sometime later. That is the natural consequence of adding value to the process.
Hi, welcome to Engineering a Startup, the podcast where I talk to people who know way more than me about startups and entrepreneurship and really just try to learn what it takes to make it. I'm Akash Goyal, and today I'm talking to David Orban, who's the founder and managing partner of Network Society Ventures, which is a seed stage investment firm that invests in startups at the intersection of exponential technologies and decentralization. A cool thing about Network Society Ventures is that it's a benefit corporation, and what that means is that legally, they're prohibited from maximizing profit at any cost. So really, they look for ventures that have both profit and social benefit. David is a really interesting guy. He speaks at conferences all over the world, like in Tokyo, New York, Singapore, and his investment firm has investments on every continent on Earth, except for Antarctica, although he does think Antarctica could be a great proving ground if we're planning on colonizing Mars. He shares a lot of really great insight into what investors think when they think about investing in startups, and really it comes down to thinking about how you can add value. David explains it a lot better, so without further ado, please welcome David Orban.
My name is David Orban. I am the founder and managing partner of Network Society Ventures. We are a seed stage investment firm investing in startups at the intersection of exponential technologies and decentralization.
Can you give me some examples of startups that are doing that kind of work?
Yeah, let me, for example, one of the latest investments we've made is in a South African company called Sun Exchange. They have a crowdfunding platform where you can buy as little as a single solar cell.
Mm-hmm.
And when an entire solar plant is funded, it gets installed with a smart meter.
Okay.
Measures the electricity generated locally and pays you back a 10-year annuity, giving a yield on your investment
Mm-hmm.
with a direct Bitcoin payment.
Okay.
So you can be in Norway where it's dark 6 months out of the year,
Mm-hmm.
and you will be literally streaming African sunshine in your digital wallet.
Yeah.
So this is an example I like to make because it represents several important technology trends coming together: peer-to-peer funding, blockchain, renewable energy, sensors, and the Internet of Things. And it is going also in a very positive directions in terms of social transformation and empowering people and communities.
Yeah. That's a really cool combination. It's combining solar power, crowdfunding, and Bitcoin. So how do you find startups like that to invest in?
I believe that the era where the center of venture capital was in Silicon Valley around Sand Hill Road and maybe 20, 30 miles, and then it drastically would drop in terms of probability of getting funded
Mm-hmm.
is over. So today, both people who are creating startups can be anywhere,
Mm-hmm.
or even teams can be distributed, working and collaborating online, and also investors have to be much more outgoing and meet the opportunities all over the world. I am fairly active online myself, as well as I speak at many conferences, on average 2, 3 conferences a month all
Mm-hmm.
over the world. Last week I was in Singapore, this week in New York, next week in Tokyo, and so on.
Wow.
And this is a great way to, on one hand, establish a platform for my message and what are the things that, in my opinion, are important and from an investor point of view represent the highest upside.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, to, through a very natural process of self-selection, give opportunity to startups and teams and projects to reach out to me to get to know each other and then decide whether there's an investment opportunity to execute.
Yeah. When you say a natural process of self-selection, what do you mean by that?
There are all kinds of institutional processes that are supposed to shepherd the startup through various phases.
Mm-hmm.
You apply to accelerators, then to stay in an incubator, then to start meeting investors, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And that is all good, but sometimes very constrained by definition because it is very well structured. However, today we are living in a borderless world
Mm-hmm.
where many of us are fairly open in terms of how we can be contacted, what are our opinions, what are our hot buttons, what we are interested in, what are the catalytic opportunities to get engaged.
Mm-hmm.
And so those who are alert and who are able to read those signals can really gain an upper hand, even if they didn't get introduced by a third party
Right.
who knows the startup, who knows me. You know, that is the classical way. Oh, you cannot contact an investor. You always have an introduction. And yeah, why not? That helps. But if you do you study a little bit the background and what are the themes that are really at the heart of how and where we invest, then reaching out in a cold email or over LinkedIn or whatever it is
Yeah.
could work very well as well. That is what I mean by self-selection.
Right.
That in a completely autonomous manner, somebody just says, "Hey, I am an entrepreneur for a reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
I take things into my hands. I heard this guy speaking at a conference. He very much resonates with the things we do, so I will just go out and contact him."
Right. So it's more and more in your hands as an entrepreneur. You know, you don't have to rely on certain systems to get you to certain places.
Unless you want to.
Okay.
Unless you want.
But you don't have to.
That's right. In the past, the message would be, "Oh, unless you do X, Y, or Z,
Mm-hmm.
you shouldn't even try."
Right.
And that is not true anymore.
So if someone reaches out to you, and you know, you must get contacted with people trying to pitch you their startups all the time.
Mhm.
What gets you excited? How do people get your attention?
So there are a lot of examples of how not to do things, right? Quite easy, you know. Oh, I looked at your profile on LinkedIn, and what if this Wednesday we set up a call so that I could pick your brain? And that is stomach churningly bad. That is exactly how not to do things. You know, the best attitude is to ask yourself, how can I add value? You know, and that is the question I ask myself too. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it is not simply, okay, let me put in money into a startup and then take out 10 times the amount sometime later.
Yeah.
That is the natural consequence of adding value to the process. And that the startup has to ask itself the same question with regards of building a relationship that can start from an email, and then it has to go beyond that. But even in the email, the question should be, how can I help? How can I add value to the process of opening a relationship through an email?
Mm-hmm. So, how do you find that startups add value? Do they present you with some kind of information or insight that you hadn't thought of before?
Yeah, so definitely the starting point is to make sure that if I am interested,
Mm-hmm.
they can consolidate and enrich this interest very easily and without too much delay.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say that the first email just says what the project is about, and it has to say, if you send an email and you say, "Oh, I have an interesting project that I would like to present to you,"
Yeah.
and I read that sentence, there's no reason you shouldn't say in the next sentence, and it is about XYZ.
Yeah.
You know, don't waste my attention by not saying what your project is about in just a few sentences.
Mm-hmm.
And then being alert. If I accept a connection on LinkedIn, and I'm fairly generous in doing that, you don't need to ask me for my email because the email is on my LinkedIn profile details after I accepted the connection. If I say, please send the docs via email, then you send me your pitch deck. And since you are talking to an investor, the pitch deck has to say not only what you do and what you want to do in the future and whatever else, it has to say how much money you need because you are talking to an investor. And the reason is to get money. And then it has to say, what do you plan to do with the money? How do you plan to deploy it? One,
Mm-hmm.
and what will be the outcome of deploying those resources too, right? And a lot of these are then not written in stone, but they are conversation openers.
Mm-hmm.
So on one hand, they show that you know what you're talking about, and on the other hand, it gives me the opportunity to ask questions from the point of view of a devil's advocate, to ask you what are the reasons that could make you fail.
Mm-hmm.
I am not going to open the conversations to prove to you that I'm on your side to succeed. Obviously, that is the desired outcome,
Mm-hmm.
but we need to be concerned about are the pitfalls along the road. So all the questions I'm going to ask are going to be uncomfortable and very maybe unexpected, and they will connect things that you didn't think about
Mm-hmm.
uh, because that is part of my role.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you're going to give them money, then you're going to ask them hard questions. I think that anyone who's not any investor who's not asking those kind of questions is probably not doing a good job as an investor. So, what made you want to invest in startups in the first place?
Well, I've been an entrepreneur starting 30 years ago. I originally started in artificial intelligence
Okay.
in various kinds of applications, expert systems, voice recognition, symbolic computation, etc., etc. Neural networks, even back then, even though the hardware was painfully underpowered and the algorithms were not as sophisticated as today,
Mm-hmm.
let alone we didn't have data to crunch. And then I started angel investing, established operations in Europe, in the US in various ways. And I got involved right from the beginning with Singularity University, which is based at NASA Research Park in California, founded by Ray Kurzweil, who is director of engineering at Google, an inventor, an author of best-selling books like The Singularity is Near, and
Mm-hmm.
Peter Diamandis, who created the X Prize
Yeah.
Foundation,
Yeah.
that with the Ansari X Prize organized the first contest for a private space flight.
Mm-hmm.
became Virgin Galactic. So Peter and Ray got together and created Singularity University to analyze the impact of exponential technologies on society through entrepreneurship, really. So how the positive outcomes that we see around the world are driven by the passion, the ingenuity, the creativity of people who solve the challenges that they see around themselves applying technology, whether it is in energy, transportation, health, poverty, finance, water, education, everywhere you look.
Mm-hmm.
And those who are in information technology are very familiar with Moore's law of how computers are getting better and better every year, but rather than just adding 10%, they are doubling their power every 18 months, more or less. Process of global competition that wants to prove this self-fulfilling prophecy right generation after generation of products. But through the process of digitization, basically everything is becoming like that. So when television sets were glass fish bowls, they couldn't grow in size or features. But as soon as they became computers, they exploded in functionality while at the same time becoming ever more affordable. And now the same thing is about to happen to cars that are computers with wheels, and electric cars and self-driving cars are going to unleash an explosion in creativity on how we transport atoms from one place to another, right? Whether they are human-shaped or non-human shaped. And so for the past 10 years almost, as an advisor and a member of the faculty of Singularity University, I was immersed in this kind of thinking. And I was able several years ago to ask myself, okay, if that is the case, what are the consequences? If we take exponentials for granted, what happens? And I responded to myself, okay, what happens is decentralization. And I established a think tank based in London that is now in 40 countries that studies on the ground what is going on in the lives of people and how it can be accelerated or hindered by policies that local and central governments put in place, whether it's solar in energy, 3D printing in manufacturing, hydroponics in food, trust networks, peer-to-peer learning, blockchain in finance, and so on and so forth. And so I created Network Society Ventures in order to capitalize on the tremendous financial upside that such a profound socio-economic transformation implies in a decentralized world where teams are born everywhere and they can create billion-dollar values very, very rapidly, whether in China or India or Africa or Europe or America. We haven't invested in Antarctica yet.
Are you planning to?
Well, the entrepreneurial environment in Antarctica is not sufficiently developed. But if we want to colonize Mars, we definitely have to ask ourselves what are the self-sustaining technologies that we need to develop in order to be able to do that. And Antarctica is one of the best test beds of these technologies, because if Antarctica is not autonomous, but depends on logistics and supply chains, bringing them fuel and food and whatever else from the other continents, well, okay, but they also have air, they have the ozone layer, they have so many things that make it easy, quotation marks, So how can we aspire to colonize Mars if we cannot even make an Antarctic base self-sufficient, right? So that is, let's say, outside of the current investment focus of Network Society Ventures per se, but there is a definitive line that connects all of these together because we are not only about generating financial returns to our investors as an investment firm, but we are also about strengthening the trajectory of human civilization towards resilient communities that take advantage of technology to support themselves and to have a sustainable path towards the future.
That's really interesting. I wonder if people will be using Antarctica as kind of a proving ground prior to trying to at least colonize Mars. Do you buy the kind of aggressive schedule Elon Musk kind of presents for the colonization of Mars?
Absolutely, in terms of we have to be unreasonably aggressive and then work towards eliminating every obstacle on the path towards those aggressive goals.
Mm-hmm.
If we miss them, it's absolutely fine. It is not going to be that, oh my God, the first ship with 100 people to Mars didn't leave by 2028.
Mm-hmm.
It is going to leave by 2035 or 2038 or 2045, whatever it is, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't try, we won't succeed.
Yeah.
And it is existentially important that we try and keep trying. And Elon Musk today is one of the best in making us dream big.
Do you think privatization is important for these kind of developments, similar to, what Peter Diamandis did with the X Prize? It gets people working in a way that, A, you're creating technological, social development, but it's when you do it for profit, as opposed to, NASA and the government.
Several technological developments are the outcome of violent conflict. Whether it is, the firearms or dynamite that we use in mining today, or whether it is the radar that was developed in after World War One, before World War Two, somewhere out there, to check enemy aircraft that we now use in civil aviation, whether it is the internet itself that originally was born to study a communication network that would be able to survive and route messages after a thermonuclear war, right? So it looks like in the past few decades, this process stopped with no more world wars to spur technological innovation. And should be extremely grateful for that, obviously. So the responsibility is for nation states to prove themselves capable of funding fundamental research that is needed for the next breakthroughs. And I would hope that they are able to be forward-looking to the degree that they enable this. Sometimes it looks like they are not. And when they are not, absolutely, private enterprise can and should and will enter the stage.
Mm-hmm.
Now, private enterprise in the past was a trailblazer, of geographical exploration, go and look for the spice trade and the gold and whatever else, right? And then as the risk of private enterprise would establish beachheads and communities would form, those communities naturally transformed in a public sphere, and that public sphere got established. We are, however, going a bit far from startups and entrepreneurship, aren't
Well, yeah, no, that's true. But I think these are just really interesting topics. So, yeah. So to bring it back to the network society ventures, what are kind of the challenges of creating and running a venture fund?
so, everybody has his and her own challenges, right? For a venture fund, fundraising is the first stage, finding investors who believe in you and who want to enable you to deploy funds, creating a sustainable deal flow that is not just a blip, but that feeds the filtering system that you have to put in place, making sure that those filters are both meaningful and create a differentiation with respect of how you make decisions compared to other firms. You need to be valuably different rather than just a copy machine replicating business book mantra. And then after you make the investments, the need is definitely there to manage those investments towards a successful exit, and this is the mix in the life of a fund, where these days, of course, with token sales and initial coin offerings, there is a very exciting transformation in the industry itself. Later stage funds concentrating on B, C, D, E rounds may look at this differently, but a seed stage fund like Network Society Ventures is very well aligned with the interests of an entrepreneur that after taking a seed investment will say, hey, I've proven that a project makes sense. There is actually a need for what I'm developing. I have a certain degree of traction and indicators that I can document it with. I now want to organize a token sale. That activity will be aligned in terms of interest with ours as well. So we are extremely supportive for our investee companies to explore a path towards what tokenizing their activities means, what are the new business models that become available as a consequence, and how implementing a decentralized network application model can bring them to the next stage of their development.
Is it difficult to manage ventures when they're kind of globally spread out? You know, if you're working with a company in Africa or in Asia, is it difficult for you to manage or interface with them?
It is a trade-off. If on one hand I am proudly leveraging a global deal flow that is of high quality and is extremely interesting in developing new markets with new approaches, etc. On the other hand, obviously, the natural consequence is that these will be globally distributed, and then I have to face whatever that means. On the other hand, our firm itself is decentralized and working and collaborating online, being able to effectively do that is today, I think, a really important feature. Not every company will decide to do so, but there are some who are extremely effective in being decentralized and distributed and still wonderfully executing on their plans. A good example is Automatic, the makers of WordPress,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of the leading web hosting and web creation platforms, both in its self-hosted and centrally hosted versions on WordPress.com. And Automatic is about 500 people, and they don't have an office. Everybody works where they want, and they periodically have a group meeting in person per department. Designers or developers or marketing or other departments will meet maybe on a quarterly basis or when they feel there is a need for that kind of in-person meeting for a few days.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, they have been able to grow the company and be, they are valued over $1 billion. They are a startup unicorn in this global modern fashion. And there is a book that I recommend reading about how they are organized. It's entitled A Year Without Pants. And it is the chronicle of somebody who worked at WordPress in this very, very modern and novel fashion.
That's really cool. I know there's more and more people working remotely and not having offices just because everything is through the internet, but a 500 person company doing that is really crazy, really exciting. So, you kind of told me what companies shouldn't do when they're talking to you, but I'm still curious, what makes you decide to invest in a company?
Well, so there are some fundamental criteria that have to be established, right? The most important is the timing of the initiative. I've failed at many things I did because I tend to love technology at an excessive degree, and I overestimate both the power of the technology at a given time and the readiness of other people who are not in my same position or mindset in adopting that technology, right? So you have to be starting to put in the maximum effort at the right time, not sooner than it is right. Um, it is actually maybe a bit paradoxically less risky to be a bit late because just like Alta Vista is not our favorite search engine, and you may not even know what Alta Vista is, but it used to be the leading search engine. But it is for many or most of our listeners probably Google, just as Friendster or MySpace are not our favorite social networks, but for most of our listeners is probably Facebook. Whatever new technology comes out, the first to test it may be a leader, like Apple was one of the first to come out with a personal computer, and Apple still is in a leadership position, right? But it is not necessarily so.
Mm-hmm.
Another extremely important component is the team, their capacity to work together and to execute. The founding team is, of course, crucial. Their character, their chemistry, their capacity to be resilient in the face of challenges that they will be unavoidably facing. And so there are many other very standard and normal criteria like this. And after they are established, for me, really, an important component is what are the positive outcomes that the investment creates in society. Network Society Ventures is a benefit corporation. This means, from a legal point of view, that we are prohibited from maximizing profit at any cost. If the cost of maximizing profit is destroying the market or harming stakeholders of various kinds because of what we do or what our investee companies do, we are legally liable for that. That we cannot do that, and that very explicitly incorporates what also is our vision for the future. We believe that technology is a positive sum game. It has been for the past 10,000 years what propelled human civilization forward, and we want to invest in those projects that keep us on this path of addressing our challenges globally through technology.
Makes sense. That's really cool. Since we're basically out of time, there's one last question that I'd like to ask everyone, which is, if you had any one piece of advice for someone thinking about getting into entrepreneurship, what would you tell them?
Don't do it because it is fashionable. Don't do it because you were in your own environment unable to get a steady job that you really wanted, and that is what you think is more corresponding to your nature. Only do it if you are passionately driven by a desire to solve problems, and if you know that your resilience and capacity to withstand stress and pressure and doubt and failure are abnormally high, because the daily life of a startup is about doubt and pressure and stress and failure and mistakes. It is not triumph and success and covers of magazines and prizes won. So it has to be there. That passion, that desire to solve problems has to be there. Building teams, knowing that you will have to keep learning new skills or find the people who are good at the skills that you cannot learn. And if you feel that you are that kind of person, then startups are extremely exciting, and then you can to do the next stage. Do you really want to take on venture capital or not? A lot of companies grow and are extremely successful without taking on venture capital. So it is not necessarily the path and the route that you want to take. And it is a community of doers, and to be part of a community of doers reinforces one's desire to go out and do things, right? So being part of a startup itself is being part of a community that today is global. And so after starting the first startup, regardless of the outcome, whether successful or unsuccessful, the likelihood that you will want to do the next one and the next one and the next one is very high. And I wish everybody among our listeners great success and great fun in doing so.
That's it for the podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and thank you, David. One thing I really got a kick out of was the startup that David's firm invested in, the South African company that crowdfunds solar cells through Bitcoin investments. The idea of a startup that's a crowdfunding platform for renewable energy built on the blockchain sounds like the punchline for a bad startup joke. But it's really cool that it's a totally viable, super awesome idea. And not only can it make a ton of money, but it can also do a lot of good. And I think that was at the core of everything David was saying, which is adding value. How can you add value? If you're always thinking in terms of how you can add value, then that's probably the best way to be successful. Anyways, thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate it. As always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns about the podcast, if you want to be on the podcast, if you want to listen to more podcast episodes, please check out engineheringastartup.com. You can also find Engineering a Startup on iTunes, the Apple Podcast app, Google Play Music, Stitcher, wherever. And, feel free to rate it, review it, all of that kind of stuff. But really, if you're thinking of a way that you can help the podcast, the best thing is probably to tell a friend about it. If there's someone else who you think could benefit from hearing this conversation, tell them about it. That, in my opinion, is the most helpful thing. Alrighty, that's it for this episode. And until next time, keep thinking. What will you create?